Hey everyone, welcome back. We've got the whole team this week to chat about the Sony RX1R III. It's been an extremely busy week. There's a lot of strong response to the release of this camera. I wanted to start by inviting the whole team to just talk about their experience shooting with Sony cameras and then address specific reader feedback because there is quite a lot. So Abby, I'll start with you because I know you also shoot on Sony.
I am a Sony shooter. I'm kind of an accidental Sony shooter. My husband, I guess it would have been 6 years ago, decided to become a YouTuber and was going to get himself a camera and picked up the A7 III. And I was at the time using a Nikon D800, which was getting a little bit elderly. So I just took over the Sony and made it my camera and then have built out lenses and used that. He also has, oh no, I'm blanking on the name of it now, the little point and shoot.
RX100?
Yes. He has one of those, and I've used a few other Sony cameras for reviews, but that's kind of the extent of my Sony experience.
What about you, Mitchell?
I have obviously shot with the sort of various recent Sony cameras for our reviews process, specifically when we're doing sort of lens sample galleries. So that's the A7 R5 and the A7CR, which will be very relevant for today's conversation. And just I've shot with a bunch of different ones over the years. So a couple A7Ss and the RX100. I want to say two. Maybe I decided for some reason to film a project on that in college, which is not sensible, but it's what I did.
And you, Richard?
I've been known to use Sony cameras. I reviewed the original RX1 and several A7 series cameras, A7Ss, A7Rs. I've used and wanted to like all of the RX100 series, not with great success. I reviewed the SLT 350, which is not something I ever want to go through again. So yeah, I've put in my time with Sony's.
And Dale?
Wow, I've been at DPReview long enough that I think I've had the chance to use most of the Sony cameras that have come out in the last decade or so, including mirrorless cameras and compact models and even some video cameras. So I feel like I'm pretty well-rounded in terms of knowing the Sony universe. I think the thing that's really interesting to me about this camera is I was, and I'll say accidentally, at the launch of the RX1R II, the camera's predecessor, about 10 years ago. And interestingly enough, Sony treated that as a bit of a surprise too. So there's definitely some parallels in terms of how they're handling the launches across this product line over time.
There was a lot of sort of pent-up demand for such a camera, and I think we'd all got to the stage where we just assumed it had served its purpose and Sony had moved on. So yeah, a bit of a surprise for everybody, but at least it meant that it wasn't all over the rumor sites for weeks beforehand and everybody knew the spec, so there is actually some interest in it. So yeah, a little bit of frantic running around and cross-checking information from various sources and checking with Sony, and they're like, no, that's not correct. It's like, well, so yeah, all good fun, but yeah, and there's meant to be one winging its way to us as we speak.
If you're not familiar, the RX1 series is sort of the full frame fixed lens compact cameras that are like quite small. I believe this one has the 61 megapixel sensor from the A7 R5 and a 35mm f2 lens, which is the same as is it the previous two iterations?
It's all of them. They've all used the same 35mm f2 lens right back to 2012's RX1, though that was contrast detect only, so that was interesting. Lovely camera in many respects, but the focus was not snappy.
But similar. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Richard.
I'd finished.
Oh, I was going to say similar. It's probably very similar in concept to the Fujifilm X100 series. Granted that's a crop frame sensor, but 35mm equivalent fixed lens camera, relatively compact. So essentially designed to appeal to the same kind of shooter.
Yeah, I mean, the Leica X series is also quite an interesting reference point, which again, fixed lens, that was an APS-C camera, but with an obsession on it being as small as it possibly could be. You know, the X100 has the hybrid viewfinder. It's got a lot of external controls. You know, the XF10, and there was another camera that was essentially the same one, X70, show that you can make an APS-C, you know, fixed lens camera smaller than the X100. But the X100's priority isn't size, whereas the RX1 series is about as small as you could make that camera.
Yeah, that's a big discussion point that I want to get into today around form factor. And obviously price, always contentious. I feel like that has been a theme in all of these discussions that we've had since we started this series. But I do want to ask the question, because people in the comments across the site and on social don't understand who this is for. Truly, who is this camera for? One of my favorite comments was, I cannot imagine what kind of people will buy this. Maybe only wealthy people. Can't think of a single reason why someone would need this. So I'm very curious what the group thinks about who are they actually trying to reach with this camera.
Photographers, you know, and unfortunately, yes, wealthy photographers. It's the list price in the US is $5,100. So, you know, that's, by its very nature, that's going to very much limit the market. But I've seen, you know, much like X100 series, I've seen wedding photographers who have an RX1 slung over their shoulder in addition to their main gear. It's, you know, and to an extent, it's the same people who are buying Leica Q3s and Q3 43s. I mean, $5,100 seems expensive until you look at those ones which are currently, the Q3 is $6,735, and the Q3 43 is $7,380. So, you know, if we accept that those cameras have a really loyal following of, you know, pretty dedicated photographers with enough disposable income, then that's who this is for. You know, fixed lens cameras, I think we may have covered this in a recent video. A fixed lens camera is not an interchangeable lens camera where the lens has got stuck on. It's a slightly different thing. It's self-contained in its purpose. You know, it only does one thing, so it makes you think in that mindset, but also it's a self-contained purchase. You know, it's $5,100, but once you spent $5,100, there are no more lenses to buy. You're never going to be tempted to, you know, you've got a camera that's going to last you, you know, 10, 20 years or whatever. No, I'm not trying to defend that price, but I'm trying to say that, you know, a fixed lens camera, some of them get really pricey, but, you know, considering that that is the end of your purchasing, that may take the edge off it somewhat. But the other thing is size. You know, you've always paid a premium for compactness, and even compared to the relatively compact A7CR, the RX1R III is really quite small.
And I think the Leica Q3 comparison is a good one because those share the same sensor. Also, funnily enough, the 35mm lens on that falls between the two Q3 models. It's like, I think they are sort of directly targeting that buyer, not the buyer who is interested in the A7CR because it's such a good deal. And that's you know, a different audience for sure.
Yeah, and some of, you know,
Go ahead, Richard.
so yeah, and some of that, you know, the RX1 series has always tried to position itself, you know, it's always been a premium product. When the first one came out, it was something like 20% more expensive than the A7R when that was launched, even though the A7R had a higher resolution sensor. You know, it had nominally higher spec and was interchangeable lenses, but was appreciably cheaper than the RX1. You know, this is a premium product. By contrast, the A7CR is a cut down A7R5. You know, it has its corners cut. It's not as well built. It loses its AF joystick. You know, so it's interesting to compare a cut down A7R5 and a shrunk down, but camera trying to have sort of premium vibes. I can completely see why you'd compare them, but they're actually surprisingly different things considering how many elements they have and literally components they have in common.
It's very easy to look at a camera like this and say all they did was shrink down an A7R5 and put a 35mm lens on it. And I've seen a number of comments to that effect. And it's a lot more than that from an engineering standpoint. This is a device where everything on the device is custom designed to make that device as compact and efficient as possible. Case in point, if you put a lens on an A7CR, there's a gap between the lens and the sensor. There's a gap between the lens and the sensor on the RX1R as well, but it is so thin you can barely, I mean, a business card will barely slide into that slot, and it is insanely tightly engineered to get it as small as possible. And you're not going to have an easy time replicating that with any kind of interchangeable lens system. So I think it's important to keep in mind that it's not just that it's a small camera, but it's very tightly engineered for all of these parts to be absolutely as small as possible.
When you say photographer, is there a specific genre of photography that we're talking about here? I want to drill into that because I think we had 457 votes as of this morning. Only 35% of the audience was actually excited, and the majority of comments are ripping apart the lack of features, not understanding who it's aimed at, right? So when you say photography, let's drill down into that a bit more because the form factor also plays a role in that.
Yeah. I mean, to an extent, it's the same people who, it's broadly whatever genre you might use an X100 for, it's for exactly that. Self-contained camera that you might carry everywhere, with an incredibly versatile lens. I mean, there are certain popular YouTubers who loathe the 35mm format, but there are very much people who prefer 28 or 43. Noticeably, Leica makes a lens that's wider than this and one that's slightly tighter than this. But 35 is a good balance for a lot of people. I remember a couple of years ago, there was a video of Annie Leibovitz shooting a portrait, and slung over her shoulder was an X100. It's a very, very flexible focal length. If you're going to have one focal length, it's one of the more flexible ones. And so it can be used for a little bit of everything. And I think, there will be some people who just want the nicest, compact camera they can buy and will use it for just photographing the world around them. There'll be people like wedding photographers, portrait photographers who will have it as their second camera just to, maybe get the atmosphere of the scene, or, just to have something other than their main camera. It'll be both a main camera for some people and a second camera for others. But in terms of specific genres, I think it's just whatever you feel like using it for. It's small and it's flexible is so much of the appeal.
I think given its size too, it's one of those things where it's like if you are going somewhere where space is at an absolute premium, it's definitely one of the options that you've got in a way that fixed lens cameras like really only can be. I would probably not buy one, going back to the question of like who is this for, but I really hope that some rental houses do, because I can absolutely imagine myself renting one and taking it on vacation and just like carrying it around a new city and using it to shoot various things that I see that are interesting.
In contrast, Mitchell, I'm probably the kind of person it is made for. I have an X100. I've had a couple of X100 cameras over the years, and they are my go-to travel camera. I have really come to embrace that all-in-one zoom with your feet model when you need to do it type of shooting. And there's trade-offs to it, but I really enjoy just carrying around a single camera with a 35mm lens in most cases, and I could absolutely see enjoying this camera. Price-wise, it's not in my budget range right now, and I appreciate that that's true for a lot of people, but I can see the draw to it if you can afford it.
Abby, you recently wrote an article about our travel photography preferences. Is this resonating with you? Would you do it if you could?
Yeah, that's what I've been thinking during this conversation about genres. I think travel is a perfect situation for a camera like this. And when I travel, I generally bring my A7 III with just a 35, like super compact 35mm. But this camera would be a great alternative to that because it would be even smaller. So if I could have a smaller bag and not have to worry as much when I'm walking around places and have something like this, I think it would be super ideal. Again, the price out of my budget, so not an option, but I think travel photography makes complete sense for this camera. I think street photography, it could be really popular for. Having that small form factor and the kind of discreet camera is really ideal for those types of situations. So I think those two especially are genres that I could see this camera being ideal for.
Just to make sense of the price, one thing I did notice is if you compare the launch prices of the different RX1 models over the years, the RX1, RX1R, RX1R2, RX1R3, to the current X100s at that point, in the UK, the launch price of the RX1 and RX1R was basically 2.4 times the price of the contemporary X100. The RX1R2 was around 2.6 times the price of the X100T, and sure enough, the RX1R3 is 2.63 times the price of the X100-6. So, in the UK at least, it's the pricing is pretty consistent. And if you think about it, a full frame sensor is 2.36 times bigger than an APS-C sensor. So, I'm not saying that's how they work out the pricing, but you are sort of getting what you pay for. Do it in the US again, and 2.2 times ratio on the first one, 2.6 just as in the UK on the RX1R2, and then this one 3.2. So yeah, there is something going on in the US, and we all know what it is, but nobody wants to stick their head above the parapet by saying it. But yeah, outside the US, it is an expensive camera, but it's expensive in proportion to what you'd pay for a comparable model.
Just out of curiosity, I took a look back at our own product database to see when some other cameras had been introduced, and I do notice that the predecessor, the RX1R2, was launched shortly after Sony finished its launch of its Series 2, its A7 Series 2 camera. So the A7 II, the A7S II, the A7R2. And it was almost like, okay, here's the 3 category cameras. Now let's have some fun. And I think over the years, those 3 series have kind of got out of sync. Some, we've got an A7S III, we've got an A7R5 now, etc. But I do wonder if this is maybe a signal that we've reached some end of some technology era. Now we're having some fun. Now Sony's going to throw all these bin pieces into a special camera. And does this signal that maybe the next camera is the next technology revolution or the next technology step that Sony wants to introduce? I have no idea if I'm right, but speculating.
It is possible. I mean, we've seen in the past. I think the Fujifilm X-H1 is a great example of why you don't build your flagship product around the end of a generation of technology, because then everyone gets upset the moment you introduce a more modest model with better tech in it. But I think you could be right. One of the comments Mikim highlighted was somebody saying, "Well, why are they messing around doing this instead of introducing an A7 V?" And that's a really interesting question. Because we've got the likes of the Z6 III from Nikon. The competition in that's the $2,500 market is by far the highest selling. Unsurprisingly, the lower end stuff sells better, and $2,000 is not that low end. Sony has introduced the A7C2 at $2,100, right in the middle of that market. But that was essentially a cut down A7 IV. So yeah, what's happening with the A7 V? So you could be right. We could be about to see whatever technology is going to underpin the next generation of alpha cameras. And again, I think that's sort of part of the role of this camera, is to say, we understand photography. Here is this gleaming camera that you will probably never see, never own, but it sits at the top of our lineup to tell you that we get photography.
It's so interesting that you make that point, because so much of the response, at least on social, has been This is Sony missing the mark. This is Sony not understanding parts of its core audience.
It's also sort of one of those situations where this is a thing that a lot of photography enthusiasts want. They want a camera like this or some sort of compact. There's a lot of photographers who feel that their needs for their wants for a camera that's small, that they can take with them, and that has really high image quality aren't being met. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the compact market largely is shrunk quite a bit in terms of available models, availability of the models that are still around. And there's been a lot of demand for these types of cameras. And when a manufacturer releases something like this, a lot of people, or, you know, the X half, which we've discussed, people will be like, well, this isn't what I'm looking for. Why did you spend your time on this rather than what I want? And it's it's a valid concern, especially with how much that market has shrunk and how old some of the models in it are. But that isn't what this is. It's, like Richard said, a Halo product.
Yeah, that said, the previous version was, back in 2015 was $3,300. And if you account for inflation since then, that would be about $4,500. I mean, as I say, it was always a premium product. It was always going to be punchy. My favorite genre of comment, and I say that quite incorrectly, is people who say, "Oh, it should cost this much." I've seen a couple of comments saying, "Oh, if it was $1,500, I'd put my name down." Like, so you want it to cost half as much as the original version from 2012, and actually less than the X100, which is so in demand that Fujifilm can't make enough of them. Mate, I mean, I think everyone would put their name down if it was $1,500, but that's not, taking an almost sensible number and then dividing it by 3 probably isn't the way that Sony's coming up with this pricing policy.
Can we talk a little bit more in depth about lack of features and new features? Let's start with IBIS and the tilt screen.
Yeah, we've said that a lot of the appeal of this camera is the size, and particularly in the light of the A7CR, Sony has made a compact ILC with a full frame sensor. Well, in which case, to separate this model, you've got to go even smaller, and that means they've had to absolutely shave away anything that they can to try and keep the body size down to the same size as the previous models. As Dale says, the lens pretty much touches the sensor. Also, to keep the lens size down, it pretty much only illuminates the sensor and nothing beyond it, which means if you were to move the sensor and have in-body stabilization, well, you're going to end up sampling bits of the image that aren't lit by the lens, or you're going to have to completely redesign a new lens with stabilization in the lens. They haven't done that. What they have done is address one of our biggest criticisms of the previous camera was battery life. More than once I've made the joke that it gave such a sort of authentic film-like experience that you had to think about slotting a new cartridge in after every 36 photos. It wasn't quite that bad. It was, you could often get like 100 photos out of it, but the battery life was dismal. They fitted a battery that's nearly twice the depth and something like twice the capacity. I did sit down and work it out into this new model without making the camera thicker. And of course, that something's got to give. What they've chosen to do is use a fixed screen rather than a tilting screen to save, probably 4 millimeters off the back of the camera. Until I've used it a bit more, I'm not going to try and comment on whether that's a good decision or a bad one. I can't help but notice that the first 5 iterations of the X100 series sold quite happily with a fixed screen on the back. It's with a wide-angle camera, I tend to want to get low down and want to do some low shots, some high shots. Suddenly, that tilting screen becomes absolutely necessary. And I can say, it certainly has value, but I think time will tell whether it. I think there are some people for whom it won't be an absolute essential, and they would rather have that absolute smallest camera. But yeah, I'd want to spend a bit more time with it before deciding whether that's a hit or a miss, and that'll be a question of personal taste. And the same goes. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
And the same goes for the viewfinder. I've seen a lot. Oh, they must have a warehouse full of these viewfinders. Well, that is the highest resolution viewfinder Sony makes, and Sony supplies most of the OLED viewfinders in most cameras, or a different division of Sony. That is the highest resolution panel you can get in the 0.39 type format. So if you want a higher resolution, you have to use a larger viewfinder panel, which suddenly means that the bigger corner of the camera gets taken up. You probably need deeper optics. All of a sudden, you've made your camera bigger. But it is unfortunate in that you've got this this super premium product, $5,100, using the same viewfinder as some of your bottom of the range models. But again, it's purely a question of size, and this camera prioritizes size above all things. And if that isn't, if you can be a bit more flexible on size, well, there are much cheaper options out there.
The Ricoh GR4 and 3 and 2 and 1 also have fixed screens and no viewfinder. So there's something to think about. They are substantially cheaper, but well, I guess pricing for the 4 hasn't been announced yet, but it seems like a pretty safe bet that it will be substantially cheaper. It's also interesting to see sort of this the lack of IBIS criticism levied at it, since that was also a concern with the GFX100 RF, which is Fujifilm's fixed lens medium format camera. And which costs, interestingly, right around the same amount as this. It has comparing
it to that now, right?
And it's fair. That one does have a tilting screen and a very high resolution viewfinder, but it's also a much larger camera. Partially owing to the fact that it has a larger sensor in there. But it's an interesting comparison. I think they're largely targeted at a similar type of user. Though with the RX1, I suspect the lack of IBIS is going to be slightly mitigated by the fact that it has a faster lens. In most situations, I feel like I could get away with an f2 lens without needing a bunch of stabilization. Would it be nice to have it? Absolutely, but for me, it wouldn't feel necessary. The GR3 and 4 also do have a stabilized sensor as well, so that's worth noting.
There's a tendency when any new camera comes out for us, and when I say us, I'm not necessarily meaning the us on this call right now. I mean us, the camera world, the camera nerds of the world. We tend to look at it and always wish it had the highest specs in every area, and that would be great. I mean, high specs are wonderful. I love using high spec cameras. But there's always the trade-off of what is the usability, what is the size, what is the functionality. I mean, would I love a higher resolution viewfinder on this camera? Absolutely. But you know what? I've shot for years on cameras with viewfinders with the same resolution as this camera, and I can't think of a one where that slightly lower resolution viewfinder kept me from getting a photo that I wanted to get. So yeah, is it a less nice experience? Yeah, maybe. Will it prevent me from actually getting a photo with the camera? Probably not. Will it get the camera down to that magic size that might make me go, that's something I might get instead of this interchangeable lens thing? Yeah, if it accomplishes that, then I think it hits the mission that it needs to.
There also is, obviously, it is fine to make products that directly compete with others, but if you are looking for ultra premium, full frame fixed lens camera with a stabilized lens, not sensor, and a tilting screen, it exists. It's the Q3. You can buy that. And so it would be, a bit odd for Sony to release a thing that's like, hey, here's essentially the same camera just without a red badge on it. Though, people do joke sometimes that that's exactly what they want. They want the Leica without the Leica tax. And hey, there you go.
One thing I think is interesting is that everybody has admitted on this call that this camera is out of our price point. And there is a misconception that we're always upgrading. We always have access to the latest thing. It's part of the workflow, but on a personal level, this camera is completely inaccessible for me and many of the other content creators that I work with. I do more video than I do photo, as I've shared, but I'm curious, Abby, for you sort of fell into Sony accidentally. were you at all excited by this camera, or is it just like completely out of the range of possibility for you?
I was excited by it, but it's still out of the range of possibility. So it's definitely something that I could see myself owning if I had the budget. But price wise, yeah, that's not a realistic thing. But I think it's an exciting camera. I like the idea of it, and I would love to take it on trips with me and use it as my kind of go-to camera for those sorts of things. But that probably won't happen. So that it is what it is. But I do think it's an exciting camera from my perspective.
And Richard, today you actually wrote a piece about a direct comparison to the A7CR, positioning the price and the features. Can you tell us a little bit more about where you landed with that?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of what I've already alluded to. It's if you like the idea of a self-contained camera that does one thing, and I personally really do, then the RX1R III will make a lot more sense to you. Sticking a 35mm lens on an ILC isn't quite the same thing. It doesn't get quite as small, but the vast majority of people, that will be the more sensible option. It's interesting because the A7CR is Sony's sort of, it's their cheapest, it's their budget high megapixel camera, and it is probably the most image quality you can get out of a camera that size, certainly anywhere near that price. It's not a camera I particularly love myself, and yet I have really fond memories of using the original RX1, despite the fact that the focus was really slow. Sony hadn't really got its colors sorted out by that point. It still had the diabolical old menus. The battery life was too short. There are a couple of there's a photo in particular I remember taking of a friend and just going, oh, actually that is something, that is that step beyond the X100 that I'd become used to using. And I used to be an X100 owner. That's exactly the kind of camera I like. So there is this group of people for whom this might make sense. Not necessarily at the US price, but at these slightly more reasonable prices elsewhere in the world. I think it will find its audience. I think that audience is small. I think most people, certainly if you're taking a really sort of pragmatic approach to it, if it's just like, okay, I need this many megapixels and I need it to be quite small, but I want to be able to fit different lenses. I mean, the A7CR is, for almost everybody, is the most logical choice. But I think this will have a very specific appeal to some people in exactly the way that, the Q3 and the Q3-43 are wildly more expensive, and yet they're finding their audience. And despite the the eternal snarky comments on the internet, it's like, oh, dentists. Well, yeah, I think it's rather short-sighted to believe that Leica solely exists for people with more money than all the gear and no idea. That's just not the way the world works. So I think it'll have its audience. Unfortunately, it's probably not going to include me, but I'm looking forward to putting some time in. And I'm very fortunate to be in the position where I'm going to get to spend some time with it. But yeah, you could buy a bike for that.
You could buy a lot of things for that.
I've bought many cars for that.
Last question I'm curious about, the time between the predecessor. 10 years? Why drop this now? Any thoughts, Dale, being there at the original launch?
I'm not entirely surprised that it's been 10 years. This camera is not Sony's bread and butter. This is not how they're hitting their sales targets and their revenue targets every quarter. This is a specialty product that's designed for a subset of photographers who are willing to have that kind of, who want that kind of camera and are willing to spend that kind of money. And I think the way they handle the introduction of these things is actually a really good indicator of that. Most Sony cameras, we get some briefing ahead of time. Typically, usually we get some kind of access. It's true with a lot of cameras, and that's true with much of the camera press. With both this camera and the RX1R II, There was none of that. They kept it a real secret until the moment they announced it, because they wanted people to open their eyes and go, oh, wow, that's an interesting product. In fact, I'll share a really little anecdote. In 2015, I was actually in New York City for a Sony launch event. I believe it was the A7S II at the time. And the entire event was built around the A7S II. There was a breakfast event the next morning that everyone went to at Sony headquarters. And surprise, surprise, the person who showed up to talk to us was Kaz Hirai, the CEO at the time of Sony, who had flown from Japan. And he had this camera in his hand, and you could tell he was passionate about this camera. He said, look, I'm a photographer. This is the camera that I wanted to build. I wanted us to make something like this because people who are really into photography will get it. They'll get it, and they will appreciate it for what it is. So I think there is this mystique around it. And there is this attitude from Sony. I think that this is a specialty product. They get that it's not for everybody, but for the people who get it, they will get it.
I think there's also something to be said for, with a camera like this, where it is a special thing, and where you're going to be dropping a large amount of money on it, it is nice to be able to feel like you have the best version of that available for a while. And specifically with a lot of cameras and in a lot of industries nowadays, we've gotten past the stage where things are changing so rapidly that you can buy something 1 year and then the next year or two it'll be completely out of date and like it'll seem like old news. The camera industry is just moving slower in terms of innovation, and for this type of camera it makes sense to wait until there's like a big step change in some of the core technology for it. Like, I suspect this camera will have substantially better autofocus than the two, because Sony has just made a lot of changes to its autofocus system within the past 10 years. The sensor is, better, and it's like substantially higher resolution. Whether that'll make much of a difference remains to be seen, but it makes sense for this type of product to wait until you have something really interesting to show. Whereas with the other more workhorse products, it makes sense to do the incremental revisions where each couple of years it gets a bit better because people are buying them every couple of years.
And with the RX1R series, I think there is very much a approach of saying to the world, hey, photographers, we can do this too. We can make this kind of camera too. We are that good. We can make a camera like this. A lot of people aren't going to buy it, but we can make a camera that's just as good as everybody else's Halo camera.
That said, to your point of why now, I think that is interesting. As I say, I was beginning to think that Sony had completely given up on this range. I thought it served its purpose of saying, once they'd sort of, moved away from the Minolta-based cameras they were making, they really were, back when the original version came out, they were really sort of saying, look, we get photography. And I thought it had served that role. One of the PR guys at Sony owns an RX1R II himself. And I think he'd given up on there being a replacement. But all of these technologies have been floating around since the A7R5. This is the Bions, I can't, it's something, Bions, whatever the process, they've all got silly names, but Bions is a particularly silly one. The Bions XR processor and the AI processing unit. I'm not going to do air quotes, but I really want to. But this processor has been around since the A7R5 came out in October 2022. I keep seeing people saying, oh, it's an old sensor. It's like, yeah, but it's also one of the best sensors we've ever seen. The only one I can think of that's better is the 100 megapixel one that Fujifilm and Hasselblad use, which is essentially more of the same sensor. It's just the same sensor over, those same pixels, but over a bigger chip. It's a really, really good sensor, unless you want electronic shutter. So these technologies have been around for a while. And, chances are Sony could have made this camera at any point in the last 3 years. So I'd love to know if next time I get to speak to somebody senior at Sony, why now would be an interesting question. But it could be to Dale's point, look, you refresh your bread and butter cameras first, the ones that actually sell in large numbers, get those out of the door. Then when you've got the time and the breathing space, then you update the Halo product. And to Mitchell's point about autofocus, the one thing I'm really looking forward to finding out is how much of a bottleneck was the lens, because that's a 2012 design. It's got a stepper motor, but more to the point, it's moving quite large glass elements around within it. So there's inertia when you're trying to make focus movements. Will the latest generation of processing, which is really impressive in Sony's interchangeable lens cameras, is the processing enough to overcome the slowness of the lens, or is the lens going to sort of hold everything back? It's going to be really interesting to see, because I'd like it to be good, but who knows?
Well, the camera's on its way to you. I want to thank everybody for making time after a pretty busy week to chat about it and address some very heated comments this week. And yeah, if you guys have questions, let us know. Richard's going to have it in hand for about a week or two. Is that right?
I believe so. Yeah.
Yeah. Nice.
I'm going to hang on to it for as long as I possibly can. But we're going to be against the clock trying to turn a review around, because we've been told there aren't many units. There are several events that Sony's got coming up that the cameras need to go back for. So it's going to be a bit frantic, but hoping to get it into the studio next week.